Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here and have another opportunity to speak and discuss things with you. I'm going to focus on coal, clearly. I'm going to also talk from a rather more global perspective than many of the other speakers, because that is my remit at the Clean Coal Centre. And while I want to just reiterate a couple of the points I made in my presentation 2 days ago, what I really want to focus on, just to broaden it out a bit, is public opinion and human resources issues, because I think they are, as I hope I shall demonstrate, are very important for all of the fossil industries. It may not be perhaps so evident to yourselves here in India, but certainly in many of the OECD countries, there's an enormous disconnect between the rhetoric about coal's imminent demise and its likely future use. And which the reality is, as our chairman has said, I think everyone said, it's here to stay for some time, and we can argue about how long that might be. And there's also a commitment, there has to be a commitment to use it as cleanly and effectively as possible. But certainly in the OECD countries, certainly at things like the COP meetings, certainly the ones in France and Germany, you have the environmental groups that are certainly, well, anti all fossil fuels, but they're certainly painting coal as the main cause of all the environmental and climate-related problems. And there's no consideration in their discussions or presentations about the major role it has and will need to continue to have for the foreseeable future in much of the planet. Just picking up on one of the points I made on Wednesday, sustainability is not just about climate issues. Clearly climate issues are very important, but as many people have said, you need, as a country, to have access to robust, reliable and affordable energy. Because that can have a key role, particularly in developing countries, in helping to lift people out of poverty, and it provides a fundamental building block for the nation's economy. I do actually appreciate very much the important role of renewable energy, but very much so my approach is that you have to build on that bedrock of reliability, which currently you can only get from fossil fuels. Maybe in the future, if we get effective and cost-effective storage systems, then renewables become much more the energy source of choice, because it starts to introduce that reliability component. One of the other points I think I made on Wednesday was that, particularly in places like Asia and other developing regions, coal plants, for the most part, are young. They're not I cannot see them particularly young and with state ownership in many cases becoming the stranded assets that people are demanding of the coal technologies. So again, there's also many more plants still being constructed here. So we're not talking about a coal sector which is, if you like, sliding gently into terminal decline, at least not yet for a while. You come to Europe, you'll get a very different picture. The strong policies led by the European Union are to close coal plants by about 2030. There's strong resistance in certain parts of the European Union, particularly, for example, from Poland. That doesn't have the right geography or climate, by which I mean sunshine, for the introduction of major levels of renewables. And there's a strong resistance, understandably, from Poland to the policies that are being pushed in Europe. You go further east into the eastern half of Europe, again you get a much more fossil, or very fossil fuel orientated economies. Our chairman made the remark right at the beginning, if we're going to use fossil fuels, we've got to use them cleanly. And I think the important point here, we do have much cleaner options now available than the subcritical plants that are still a very large proportion of the overall global coal fleet. I believe, as far as it's practical to do so, subcritical plants should be scrapped, and where you're going to build new plants, they should be ultra supercritical units for the high efficiency, but you also need the good quality pollutant control systems that are readily available. You know, the technology is there if we're going to continue to use coal on a much cleaner basis than we have in the past. I think the other point to stress is this industry isn't just sitting still. Though we have these excellent new technologies, there's a lot of developments which I talked about on Wednesday, transformation technologies that will take things further forward, both in terms of efficiency, even getting ever lower conventional pollutants, and technologies like carbon capture and storage. I got back last night to my hotel and started reading the daily newsletter I get through the Clean Coal Centre. And there's a whole series of very positive announcements, for example, from the USA, which has announced its plans to establish a whole range of major demonstrations of advanced technologies. And I think that's very useful and welcome news for the sector. I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture for coal, because I think even with all that, the future for coal is going to remain a very difficult one. It's becoming progressively harder to build new coal plants because the multilateral development banks are not proposing to support coal plants for very much longer. The World Bank intends to be out of coal by 2020, although the Asian Development Bank has in its remit to still build ultra supercritical coal plants. I think you would find it very, very difficult to get funding from them at the moment. There are, of course, alternative funding sources, a lot of alternative funding sources in Asia, but of course that makes the cost of capital that rather much higher. So public opinion, as coal continues to be used, is in many parts of the world is going to be even more increasingly anti-coal. So I think one thing that has to be done is to try and put out the right messages. It's fine us talking in meetings like here in a very reasonable basis, and that's great. But for some of us in other parts of the world, we've got to up our game to get the message out about coal's worth to the world in a much more high-profile fashion. If I could turn to my second point, which is the human resources issues. As the industry, you know, most of the people up on this panel, we're not in the first flush of youth. And you need a steady flow through into the systems, into the technologies, development and application and the coal production and so on of young professionals. And before them, you need students who are focused on following the degree courses that would take them into the energy sector. So when I look at young professionals and students, I wonder whether they see coal as a sector that will provide a good career prospect for them. And I hope, Chairman, we get an opportunity to ask several of the younger people here in the discussion, perhaps what their thoughts are on this. Is coal something you want to go into? Are the other fossil fuel sectors ones that you wish to go into? Or are you seduced by the cleaner energies like renewables? And I think that's very important, because if we don't get the flow of the talent into the sector as a whole, we're going to wither from its roots, as it were. So yeah, in summary, I think times are difficult for coal. There are some encouraging indications that it's proving resilient, but we have to ensure that the major success stories for HELI and other types of advanced technologies are published. And so we need to ensure that dissemination is correct, and we have to engage, I think, very closely with the students and the young professionals to see how they view coal, and to see that we ensure that we can get adequate talent into the sector as a whole. I think that's quite enough from me, Chairman. I hope that gives us some food for thought and for discussion a little bit later. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.